go to church anymore. Might have been raised in church, broke away, broken by it, don't like the rules of it, can't abide by the lawbreakers in it, and have walked away, but yet yearn for sacred. And I think that in these places of how to be sacred, I think we can all, again, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, but our truths can mesh together in finding ways to create sacred for each other in community. And I think that's one of the endless possibilities of this new construct of how to listen to call that doesn't necessarily live out into the parish of four walls. But I think there's this, and I keep reading and knowing more and more people who are called into, I don't even like to use the words traditional, alternative. You called me out on emerging yesterday, and I was like, yeah, because that's a power place. This is like, we are called to be something, and in the world, that is something that is new, and God is making a way for it. So with that, the possibilities of what I think these places of far-reaching communities that need to be held differently, but similarly. It's easy to call out the differences. I just want to call in the similarities, with a lot of, it's hard. Sometimes we just need to we're so focused on difference. I want to just because I think that's where collaboration really, really has to start, and is in the ways we are connected with each other in the many ways that you and I are. I mean, we have these ministries in the United Church of Christ, but we've been on a journey with each other for 4 years and witnessed each other's work, witnessed each other's stories, have been present with each other. And I think it's those places in collaboration and there's so many others of us coming, and there's so many of us others that are declaring this place of something new is being made. But it also is a very can be an alone place. And I just, we were just talking to Sue Art a few weeks ago. Sue Art's our, Rocky Mountain Conference minister, about the important places of collaboration for folks who are making something new. So I think, I'm doing this amazing ministry. You're doing OMO House, an amazing ministry. And can we do something together and create some other amazing kind of, which is what today is all about, to kind of start this off. So I think it's endless.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I look at this idea of community chaplaincy, one of the things that I thought was amazing working at the hospital, when people would call chaplains, right? A large percentage of people consider themselves atheist. At least on my watch, right? So what I have found is that what's beautiful about chaplains is they meet people exactly where they are, right? And really, for me, it's sort of like doing triage, right? No one, when you go into the emergency room, no one is going to fit you into a box in order to get assistance, right? Like, well, what kind of urgency do you have, and what part of your body is hurting? Oh, we're not doing legs today. You're right, like, you're not going to get that, right? So I think chaplaincy is sort of the same for me, is that it is irrelevant if you consider yourself a person of faith. It's irrelevant if you had faith, lost faith, had faith, don't want faith, don't believe. You find that this whole idea of God doesn't attract you. Like, none of that matters. For me, what matters is human to human, being to being. I stand here willing to listen. I stand here being a mirror for the beauty that you are. I
Mm.
stand here as a mirror so that you can decide what you see, and you may see something that needs to be addressed, or you may see something that you choose not to address, right? But
Right,
all I am is this mirror,
right,
right? So I
right.
think that's, to me, is the beauty of chaplaincy, and then to have it come into community, to begin to have these conversations, whether they be, the hard conversations about trauma and death and dying, or whether it be a somewhat easier conversation about race, reconciliation, privilege, whether it be a
Mm.
really light conversation about, where can I find places of joy, right? So
Mm.
chaplains can get in anywhere and say, let's talk about this, and how do we become our best selves?
Amen. Amen. Just the other day on the winter solstice, I had asked the bookstore owners here because ritual when ritual really matters, and in a setting where you were serving in the hospital, whatever people, you brought whatever people needed, and you knew what they needed. So I said to them the other day, hey, let's do how do you feel about doing some ritual making on winter solstice here at the store? And like, they were all over it.
Right.
And so I said, so to everyone who came through, I said, hey, we're doing these winter solstice rituals. Would you like to burn some incense? We have a flame going all day long, and we're going to do some flying paper burning and tea drinking, um, and it's never a surprise to me, but it's always a reminder how much we need this. See, this is a secular bookstore.
Right.
It has and they love it that way, and I love it that way. But open to having community ritual together to honor a day. I happen to be in the Pacific Northwest right now, and it got dark very early, but we celebrated the sunset by reading A Blessing by Jan Richardson. But I sat with people here and who had carved out some time in their day to be here because something spoke to them. But if we don't have these places where people can gather in for whatever reason, we're not serving well in the world where it's a hurting, broken world. And there were people who I didn't know. I was a complete stranger to them, and broke open so many things to be listened to in that day over burning incense and drinking tea. And so many people came back to them and said, this was really quite amazing. And I was glad that they got some feedback around that. But the idea that we all need to be embraced and held and listened to in lots of different ways. And, that in that small day, that very small, I don't even think the sun ever showed that day, but, that there we created some light and energy. And it was sweet. And I think that's what community chaplains do too.
Right.
We just we're not having to kind of, there's no real defining course in seminary that tells you how to do this. So we're all doing this in spirit-filled ways that we're led to be in community. And I think sometimes it's really a place of just knowing where light needs to be shed, and whether it's the hospital room, whether it's in the cyber lounge, if it's in hospice, in grief work, day-to-day living stuff. I mean, I think ritual matters, and I'm always continually reminded of it. And people then tell me, oh my gosh, it does matter. Yeah. It does matter.
So you said something that I really, really love. This idea that we can be in community in ways in which we sort of embody the light right?
Mm-hmm.
That light can
Right.
emerge, right? And so what I'm going to do is now transition, because I think one of the things that I often hear is that many folks who show up in these non-traditional spaces show up because they've been hurt
Mm-hmm.
by organized religion. They've been hurt by certain things that come out of the book and how it was translated to them. So my question that I'd love to dance with you with is, why do you think there are so many people leaving organized
Mm.
religion?
Oh, that's such a great question. And um, I, I did some research this last year about the incredible numbers of closing churches and why that's happening. And I think that we're not doing a very good institutional job on how to journey with people who are in the midst of having to discern whether to close a church or not, and then journey with them to close churches. So I've spent a year talking to people who have closed churches, clergy and lay people alike, and then I read John Dorhauer's Beyond Resistance book. He's our general minister and president of the UCC, and he was a conference minister in Phoenix many years ago, and he wrote about closing churches and why the closing churches are happening. And a lot of it really is about older buildings and older congregations. But I think, and go back to my friend who I was in conversation with, there's a generation that's coming up that is questioning the authority of organized religion, and not questioning the need for sacred, but the struggle for showing up in a building that for some people has no meaning, or the meaning is no longer important, and that there have been too much woundedness by leadership in places, that there just cannot be any middle ground of raising children into a new generation. Now, I say this with big broad brush, but because for a lot of people that really does still continue to matter. But it's about, it then comes into, what is community? I yearn for community, and if it's not this, what is it? But I think that from what and John Dorhauer tells us that there's this whole language of how to be church in new ways, and I think you're doing that. I'm doing that. Colleagues of ours are doing that we love and respect and wish for future collaborations with too. But I think a lot of it comes down to the places of longing to be in community, but not that kind of a community anymore, generationally.
Right.
I think there's just somehow we've miscalculated around how those four walls can be a place of community for people who are exactly the ones who are struggling. We've done not a great job there, bridging all of that.
Right. And I'll also throw in here that I think, it really is a new day, not just in the spiritual prophetic language, but we know more as humans, right? We're expanding. So I know one of the things for me, one of the reasons that I am not drawn to the traditional model is, I'm a big Brene Brown fan, right? So I'm all
me too.
And the vulnerability. And so
right.
I have a hard time being intimate with the back of your head, right? So the whole design of the pews doesn't work for me. I'm also a former communications professor, right? So I'm always gauging body language and position. So if I'm seated, you're standing, that's hierarchical, right? So there's so much about the tradition that is so antithetical to what we now know, reveals my connection to you, my intimacy to you, whether I'm willing to be vulnerable, whether I believe that I know more than you, right? Because here's,
Right.
you know, like I remember when I was designing my curriculum, when they said, you know, be mindful as a professor, if you're standing up over your students, there's a message that's being imparted, right? So, you know, day one, I was like, I don't want to be that professor, right? So I sat in the circle with my students, right? And it was interesting because, you know, to this day, I have former students who still reach out to me and say, like, that was beyond a communications class, right? Like, you help me see what I'm communicating when I'm speaking, when I'm not speaking, how I'm holding myself, right? So I think that is also part of the spiritual transformation, is that when we go into these sacred spaces, how we're moving through the space, how we're using our bodies in the space, people are listening to that, right? And sometimes listening to the unheard, right? So I know one of the things that I love about some of my white ally friends, they're like, I have done everything in my reality to not be in white only spaces. So if I'm going to this church and it's a white only space, I'm doing that. I'd rather go to brunch on a Sunday morning with my Black and brown and gay and old and young friends, right?
Amen. Diversity. That is community right there.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. We were just talking about that yesterday, about being mindful. You helped point something out to me that I was totally unaware of around white people gathering in white only spaces without having, and most people don't notice that. I was like, seriously, I notice that all the time. And I struggle with that in the communities of, I sit in a pew and I say, where are the people of color in this community? And that's not how this universe works. We are community, and how do we disengage from places? I mean, we hear that all the time around, but the most segregated place in the country on Sundays is churches around America. And yet we hear places yearning to say, oh, we really would like to have a representative of people of color in our community. We don't know how to do it. We want that. We invite people, blah, 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 blah. But, the bottom line is that that's not how we are trying to be in the world. We're trying to, all of us who kind of are mindful about where are the people of color in church, like me, are saying that's not how this country looks. And why is this? And I don't want to be maybe necessarily in a space that just keeps this perpetuating. And that's not even just about church. That's about, I was telling you the other day, we were talking about, these 5 very well-known white women around gathering spaces, and the vast numbers, thousands of white women showing up. And where are the people of color in places where, these mega inspirational white women stars are, being in the world? And how do we, attract audiences? How do we be mindful of, like, where are the Black people in this audience? Where are where are the people of color women in this audience? And why is this a white space and it shouldn't be? And then we were talking about this amazing young Black woman who wrote about that experience of being the only Black woman in an audience of white women. And why that sounds so not interesting to me, around being with a whole bunch of white women, listening to, inspirational white women and thinking, yeah, this is not the mix that I want to be in.
Right.
But you brought this to my attention that very few people look at that
Well,
way, and
it's not relevant, right? So, so then you get to questions of value, right? If I value your presence, then it becomes an issue that you're not there. So, and I think that's not just a black and white issue. If I don't find value in Latinx, then I could be in an all black space and not go, where are my Cubanos, my Puerto Ricans, my Dominicans, right? Like, it depends what I find value in, and the othering, right? So
right.
In the othering, and I guess I'm making up a new paradigm. There's positive othering and negative othering, right? So the positive othering is, I would then say, this particular individual has value, like how they look at the world matters to me. And so that's why I want them there, because they add to the flavor. I try to live this design as if, everything gumbo is beautiful, right? So, I mean, here's the thing. I'm clear. I could have sat here and said, okay, today Ja's going to talk about trauma, grief, right? Like, but then that's my worldview as a woman of color in this body, coming from New York, with whatever class, gender, sexuality, right? But
yes,
I believe that there's a value in your experience, in the skin that you walk in, right? So my chaplaincy journey is not your chaplaincy journey, right?
Right.
So that's why we want diversity, because we believe that the gumbo tastes better if it's got 8 different, things in it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Preach it.
So I agree with you about organized religion. I think that for many people, who are about relationality, who are about intimacy, who are about vulnerability, who are about rituals that give meaning, I think folks are beginning to question doing the same thing every Sunday. It does provide value for some people. And I think, just to push back a little, one of the things that I've always struggled with since I decided to follow this call to create this conversation is expectation, right? What does that mean? So if my expectation is, I'm not looking for transformation on Sunday morning or Friday evening or Saturday, like, if that's not my expectation, then I'm not disappointed when it doesn't show up. Right? If it's just like, I've been going to church since I was 5, I do it every Sunday, and that's what I do. But now here's the thing. I think when you lovingly challenge what's available for people, I have loved that people have been very honest with me, saying, I didn't think I was coming for that.
Oh.
So for them, it was just, church is what we do, right? And it's funny because this white supremacist, who I love to follow because I think he tells the truth, he said that he believes that the majority of Christians in this country are culturally Christian, but not spiritually Christian. And that opened up so much for me.
Wow.
Because if Christianity is the religion of the empire, then it's just about being culturally Christian.
Yeah. And I wow, that's coming from somebody who I might not want to be following, but I respect your desire to be following. Even more powerful in that language, and yet, I think for us in covenant with the institution of church, we're both members of churches, and have, I have been one of those people attending church for the most part all my life. There are a few gaps in the way, but the idea that has evolved. I think that for young families, that there's still meaning making there, raising children with a grounded place of moral education, right and wrong, how to be in the world, how to grow up to being children of God, or whatever that language means for parents, to be able to have that kind of teaching and foundational piece. I'm somebody who had that. And now how do we do that for young families today in maybe different ways,
Right.
And how to be that. But I think too, this intergenerational piece of, I think, so many people, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it is all that people have known who are still, very much present in church.
Right.
And so, honoring their truth around making meaning, especially in growing older with a community that may somehow be a mix of people they know, people they don't know, people who are new. I think for a lot of folks, having that rhythm of every Sunday morning really, really does matter. Or Friday evening, or gathering in worship in any way people gather in worship. I certainly, honor that in everyone. And as somebody who's embedded in the institution of church in ways that are life-giving many times, in many ways, frustrating in others, I think, the journeying in being your truth and my truth, and everyone else's truth around how it, in the ecclesiastical councils in the United Church of Christ, people ask, well, why do you need to be ordained to be doing your work, right? And that's such a privileged question around what, if people really already knew about you in your paper and heard you talk, why would you why would you even have to ask that?
So why do you want to be in this club? Right.
But, the idea that embeddedness into is, I think, openly one of those great, doing different kind of ministry in an institutional place in any denomination in the United States is raises all sorts of wonderful challenges in lots of different ways around how to be connected with the institution of church, and yet be able to, do secular work in a hospital or a hospice and a bookstore and call it ministry is, I think, one of the great joys of how in this 21st century things are shaping differently. And I think that's ultimately how we find our ways to serve people who may fall through the cracks. And quite frankly, I think that's what community chaplaincy can really respond to quickly. We don't have to be, we walk in it frequently as I'm the stranger, you're the stranger, we don't know each other, yet we're going to create some sort of listening presence, and each of us leave that sacred place with something powerful.
Right.
Hello.
They do. They got to do it.
Yeah.
We're talking.
So I think, there's a dance to that. There's a rhythm to that. And I think that's only going to change for the better with finding places in the universe to create sacred, that doesn't include necessarily, not to diminish that or dismiss it in ways, but I think it can add to the places of how we are in the world.
And I think there's something beautiful about acknowledging a journey, right? So the truth is, and I tell people all the time, there's something about the narrative of I and the Father are one, and behold, I've come to do a new thing, and be ye transformed by the renewal of your mind, and love those who are on the margins, right? So the narrative is amazing. And what we have to be honest about is that if the empire did not make Christianity the religion of the empire, we might not be having this conversation right now about
Correct.
how to care for people on the margin. So for me, it's that managing the both and.
Yes,
which is, some of the funkiest parts of the empire around authority and power and racism and heteronormativity and all of that are ingrained, right, in the bones of
Amen.
the church. But that doesn't mean that the Holy Spirit is not still hovering,
Right. And that's not the final story. That's
right.
That's not the final. There's more to come. Right.
So, but I did want to have the conversation about, the movement and the transformation that's currently happening. Like,
Absolutely.
not to be like the empire equals church equals bad, kill the baby.
Right.
Like,
right.
it's not
right.
that.
Right.
But to address, right, because some of the people, at least I know in OMO House, a lot of people are like, I don't identify with anything, don't even, and which is why I've even struggled, right? Some people, you say the word church, they're like, I'm deleting myself, right? Which is, we have the lounge, right? So,
right.
Of course, they want to fight now, right? It's not enough to just bark. Sorry. Anyway,
no worries.
if y'all follow OMO House, you know what happens. The dogs get happy after a while. So, so let's kind of move a little deeper. Still cultural to a certain degree, but why do you think it's difficult for our culture, specifically Western, and we know that there are folks from different cultures that hang out in the lounge, but specifically Western culture, to engage intimately or relationally around death?
Right. Well, we talk a lot about that, you and I. So bringing it to the lounge here is just super delicious. We started off with talking about how we keep our children dismissed from dying, people they love dying. And I think we have a culture that, and this goes back to my work in hospice, that I did not know any of this really until working in the healthcare field. It really was about we've all had physicians who we might have been sick, who says, we're going to try something else. We're going to try something better. We're going to try a new test. We're going to try. And, when you're young and healthy, you yield into that. But when you have a terminal diagnosis and you still have physicians saying to you, let's do one more trial, let's do, and who can't have the language of saying, I think it's time for hospice, or whatever language that's about. I think the professional medical field, physicians in general, specifically, who love their patients, have historically not been able to have that conversation. So when people do have terminal diagnosis, frequently, it's about, we use the language of military. Let's fight this battle. Right. Terminal diagnosis. Let's fight this. We're going to win. And you see it, even on Facebook frequently now. And, you just say, oh, sister, you just want to, we've kind of generationally now gotten this embedded language of fighting death, right? And in fact, death is inevitable. We just don't like to name it that way. Living life fully, but dying well is not part of our language in our culture. So right. we have people then who, can't really come to a sense of their own dying, resist it. Mm-hmm. And families then are kind of constricted by being able to have the conversations about goodbyes. Can't really open up conversation because we're, and I can remember so many occasions where in hospice, people, who were actively dying and their family then had to sign off at admission because that person was actively dying, and finally was able to get hospice into the home and died within 24 hours. And I always thought, my gosh, hospice is better than this. Hospice is, the diagnosis of having somebody have a terminal diagnosis, to come into hospice is the expectation is that you're going to die in 6 months. And what those 6 months can be rich and helpful and supportive and loving and nurturing, not just for the one who's dying, but their surrounding circle of loved ones who may be struggling and need to be supported as well. And we just are still so far away from that, being able to embrace that dying is part of life. And if we do life well, we'll die well. We were talking about that yesterday. One of my favorite hospice nurses said, people die as they lived. Right. And if you're struggling, if you had a lifetime of struggle and you're just resistant to what's coming at the end of life, then that dying is going to be more difficult and challenging in lots of different ways, and for your family as well. Right. So I think this language barrier, seriously, Ja, is still so huge intergenerationally, because then we're going back to modeling for our kids. If we're not modeling for our children well in this, they're going to grow up fearing. Right. Absolutely, because that's how kids do. Right. That's how we did.
Let me ask you to expand about on this. You said dying well. So let's dance with that. What is dying well?
Well, it goes back to what is your truth, what is my truth. Right. I think everybody's definition of dying well might be very different, but in the way that I think there's still so much misunderstanding and mystery around hospice. Why? I have absolutely no idea, because it has just not become mainstream enough. I thought it really was, but I think maybe not as much so, and maybe that's something that I need to really kind of be pausing about. But I think dying well means if you want to be alone when you're dying, okay. You just need to let us know, and no one will be there for you. But if you don't want to die alone, I think then we need to find community for you. And I think hospice can be one of those places. But it goes back to then, I've chatted about this too a lot, is this advanced directive place. I really feel like, we don't have, even though we're told to have advanced directives when we're healthy, because life can end in a heartbeat, tragedy happens, accidents do, and for people who want to have a place to be able to say, and this is how I want to be honored. Right. This is how I want to be honored. Right. If I've been in an accident and I'm on life support, this is what I want you people to do, you medical professionals to honor. I'm putting it in writing, for God's sakes, but we don't have also, because we don't want to confront that either. We have a very, 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 I should find out what these numbers are, Ja, but the percentage of probably people who have done advanced directives, even when you have children, and if you're in an accident, who do you want to raise your children? Because we can't have that. We don't know how to have language around this as, day-to-day living. Right. So when we get to the end of our lives, whatever that might be, we just don't have the language of, hey, I've thought about this a lot, or I want to donate organs. I really know what that means, or this is what I want to have happen at the end of my life. If I'm not able to have language around that, and I want to trust people, I want you to honor me. So I think institutionally, we just don't have enough real great language on how to do that well.
Right.
So when we do come to the end of our lives, if we haven't done all of that well, then things can get really complicated and messy.
Right.
You know, your son is brought in a car accident, and you've never had a conversation about what would you want, what would you want, what would you want? Those are the frameworks where physicians have to bridge that language if there's never been kind of any of these conversations about, I don't want to be on life support,
Right.
Mom, or honey, I don't want you to think that when my time comes, my time comes. That's what has to happen. I don't want you to prolong anything. All that language that is, honesty. We've talked about honesty as a form of compassion. If we're not having these familial conversations, we just then don't know. And then when we don't know, and we might be put in a situation where we just don't know, it becomes really hard to know what is right to do for someone you love. But these deep conversations are where it all starts.
Right. So, just to tie this back to current organized, right, religion, this might be something that could be happening in mosques and churches and synagogues, right?
Right. Well, UCC has actually a Lenten study on faithfully dying, where seven kind of broken out places where facilitators can bridge all this conversation.
Okay.
People like me, people like you, can kind of come into a place and actually have this amazing spirit-led, because this is spirit-filled as well, work about how to have these conversations around community.
Right.
But you're right. Collectively.
So in your experience, right, having navigated the tradition, do you find that a lot of houses of faith are doing this particular framework, or is it optional?
No. I don't know, except for one congregation where I actually taught that with a fellow facilitator. I know of no other UCC church that has used that as a model for beginning the conversation, and having that work done. I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd love to be proven wrong.
We don't know. Right. Well, I'm going to tell you, both faith circles and non-faith circles, I am not really familiar with anyone saying, you know what, this is something that will grow us as human beings, right? Let's have some really deep, powerful, vulnerable conversations about living and dying. So, I think that's a space for us as human beings to explore. Like, why are we not?
Right.
What are we afraid of? And what gift would it be to actually engage in that conversation, right?
Such a gift.
Okay.
As I bear witness with families who have had those conversations,
right?
Because then it looks very different,
right?
Then it's not as challenging at a bedside in a hospital, or on a deathbed with somebody who's resisting to get into hospice.
Right.
It's all kind of mixed up, mashed up together.
Yeah, it's the gumbo, right? The gumbo is going to happen no matter what the gumbo is, right? It's going to happen.
That's right.
A really good transition. So one of the things that, yeah, I know. And this is a question that's dear to my heart as well, because I remember when my mother died, I sort of felt as if the depth of my grief, which continues, right? Like they say that it
absolutely
gets easier, but it doesn't. It just changes, right?
That's right.
So can
the same hospice nurse, who I adore and loved being on her team with, said grief is like a bronze statue. The patina will grow and change deeper, and the colors will change. It's still going to be art. The color of the patina is going to change.
Right.
And that takes time.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but there's
no, that's great, because I think it does. It's a beautiful metaphor, which is, it is what it is, what it is. And it may shift and the colors may change. Which position you stand to observe it may change.
Oh, yes.
Right? So,
but I want to honor that moment that you were just describing with your mom.
No, beautiful. But I think that's the question is, I find that that's also part of our culture, right? That there's this idea that you grieve for, 3-point, right? Like there's a clock, there's a calendar, and then there's that unnatural, like it's too long, or, oh my God, something may be wrong because they're still, right? So
get over yourself.
Yeah, get over it, right? Like they're dead, move on. So, let's dance with this relationship that we have with grief, because I think it's also tied to the inability to talk about the conversation about dying, right? So they sort of are partners. So let's talk about grief. Are there unhealthy forms of grieving in your world, or is there no such thing? Or what is healthy grieving, if that's even real? How does one grieve to... Is there an objective, right? Like, are we grieving till we get over it? Like what, I think we don't really even talk about grief, right? We just know the 5 stages. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is like,
if we're lucky.
On stage number 3.
if we're lucky.
Right.
If we're blessed to have the book.
Right.
That powerful question, Ja. And I think it goes back to this language of bearing witness to somebody dying and or death in itself, before we even get to like the grief upon death. And we have anticipatory grief, and that can look lots of different things in lots of different ways. And I just want to honor everybody's journey of grief. That made, again, it's your truth. And it's your grief, and truth and grief are embedded together, but sometimes if we're not supported in that, before somebody dies, if we don't have people who we can talk to, or people who, and this is again one of those places, I'm the biggest hospice cheerleader you probably will ever have in your life, because good or bad, there are people who show up and are there to support and listen. And I think sometimes people don't understand that that's a big, huge part of hospice, is just showing up and listening to anticipatory grief. But there are, again, I should know these numbers, but from my own personal experience of watching hospice work after a death, the team shifts then, and the team doesn't have anything really, and not supposed to be. I mean, there's an ethical, boundary around not continuing relationship with people that you've cared for intimately, as the CNA or nurse, chaplain, social worker, because you need to, the workers need to let go, and you need to find a new way of being supported, and that's bereavement. But I'll tell you, from my own personal experience of bearing witness to lots of people, now bereavement coordinators, there are very, very few people who take advantage of bereavement services in hospice. Right. Let's say your loved one did not die in hospice. Your loved one died on the streets homeless. Where would somebody go to be held in that? Does anybody even have the resources to point people? And really, it can be hospice bereavement coordinators who take on a lot of other people who have had the deaths of somebody they love that wasn't attached to their hospice, but they serve that community as well. Mm-hmm. But do we know that? No. Do we no, we don't have that kind of like, let me write this phone number down of a hospice that I know. I love this bereavement coordinator. Right. Please call, get right. help. So I think one of the things that and just by my saying all this, I think community really matters, as in all things, community matters. If we don't have a place to go with our grief, to be held by a best friend, a colleague, a family member, a bereavement coordinator, a pastor, a community chaplain, if we're by ourselves, just digging in every day, struggling to get up because we're not having places where we can process how we're feeling and have somebody we trust listen to that, that's a rough road to be on.
And I'm also going to interject here that I also think because we're not dialoguing healthily about death and dying, it also leaves us ill-equipped, right? It's like muscle, right? It's a very weak muscle, because one of the things that I found was when my mom died, a lot of people just did not know what to say. And, you lovingly receive the conversation, but oftentimes I was like, if one more person, like, first of all, it became very, what's the word, rote, right? Oh, my condolences, right? And it's like, if I hear the C word one more time, people just did not know how to just be, right? And I think, of course, my situation was different. My mother was very young. She died unexpected. And I think that's also too, right? When we have these unexpected transitions, or someone with a chronic disease that we're like, they're going to live to be 85 and then they don't, right? We don't have the tools to.
But that is a different language.
It's a different language, but we don't even have it, right?
No, we don't
have it, right? So we end up having the same few people in our lives who love us, who really don't know what to say. Often, I know there were moments where it was like, yes, I know my mother died, but I really don't want to talk about it, because every time you bring up that my mother died, I just want to fall apart, right? So there's this, and I guess that would be Kubler-Ross's denial stage, whatever, right? But I think the beauty of beginning to have a conversation about death and dying and ritual is that, like, I could literally be in a room going, I don't know what the hell to do with this, but now that I took this 7 classes, right, where we talked about it, I can now say, you know what? I really don't know. Like, sometimes I just wanted people to go, I really don't know what to say, but know that I love you and I'm here if you need, right? But no one ever said that, but it was like the C word, and then, oh, let me go run because I'm uncomfortable being in the death conversation with you, right? So I think it brings up a lot of stuff for people, right? Like, oh my God, your mother died. My mother's still alive. I feel guilty. Or my mother's dead. So now I want to talk about my mother and not your mother. Like, it's just very bizarre.
Yes, and yes. And I think that it's a great opportunity for us to maybe do something together about this. Because
definitely, right?
Right.
Maybe that curriculum that's already done, right?
Okay, let's do it.
Right?
Let's collaborate on teaching that. But
I think it's amazing, right? So I don't think we'll have an answer for it.
No, and I just want to say it's messy. It's messy. And let's just name that. It's complicated, and we don't like complicated either. But when we just kind of start with saying it's messy and it's complicated, and but it's important to find the folks that can listen to you. And aside from all the other condolences language, I mean, we need to find, the people that can listen to that. And when we don't, I think that's a place that can ultimately become challenging and really problematic in our grief around processing that. And not just in the moment, but in the journey of years to reflect upon and be in conversation, how to, all of that becomes a real huge challenge then.
Right. Which is funny. That must be a Holy Spirit transition, because that was actually the next question. Do you think that we, and I use the word rush in the question, but that's a quantifying, but do we have difficulty around the process of mourning and grieving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
we do. And sometimes that's just the vast amount of that kind of pressure comes from work saying, hey, you get 5 days of bereavement leave and then we expect you back.
Right.
Whole.
Right.
Fully engaged.
Right.
Whoa, no, that's not how this works.
Right.
And yet we're fearful of countering that with authority about saying, well, no, I really need more than 5 days. And this is what I need. And we kind of get that pushback around, this is all we can do.
Right.
But that's also part of how we take care of ourselves. And I go back to that whole self-care place of licking our wounds and tending to our wounds that, are internal sometimes. I mean, that we need time to do that. And so if we have full-time work that we're committed to have to doing and raising kids or being in partnership with others, being with others in our families that are grieving as well, all of that can be, really hard to take in a very usually quick. I mean, we may know somebody's coming into hospice, but the moment somebody dies, it's a whole new language. We might have had 6 months, but somebody's died, and now it's a whole different way of being.
Right.
And we don't have that kind of great bridge universally for people, and it might even be there, but we don't know how to engage into it. I mean, yeah, people will get a bereavement letter if you're in hospice, and I'm, saying, I'm so sorry for the death of your loved one, and we're here for you. But I know that hardly anybody engages in that because our society kind of forces us to kind of I'm back in the saddle. I can't. When in fact, every core in your body is saying, I really need this.
Right.
But we just can't sometimes.
It's not part of the paradigm. Yeah. Well, and that's, I think that you've planted a beautiful seed because, as much as I celebrate that we're 5 years old, I also say this is just the beginning, right? So
Yeah.
that is something that I would love to see, OMO House as we grow and expand, right?
Mm.
How do we, one, begin to integrate some of the indigenous designs, right? So I know
Yes.
for me, what actually helped me with my grieving and my mourning was a remembrance oh, you practice African traditional religion. You make an altar for your mother.
Nice.
Right?
Oh.
So, yeah. And I mean, and it's not, and as much as I love calling it African traditional religion, right? Because that's our word for it. This is all indigenous cultures. When I meet people
Absolutely.
who practice things like Wiccan and whatever, they talk about having altars.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Asian culture, they call it ancestral veneration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are many, many diverse ethnicities that had connection with the ancestors that, and I love talking about this guy, he did a piece, I think you and I talked about this. He studied the early church, and he talked about the relics, that people would take the relics of the saint, and it was veneration. It'll come to me, and maybe I'll throw it under the link. But there was this idea that even those who were the early Christian converts, there was a connection between the ancestors. As a matter of fact, when I got to the section where he talks about folks would actually do these big old picnics in cemeteries, and the new church was they got to stop that, right? They just got to stop it because it's not what we're trying to promote as Christianity. So I think that we have lost the relationship. I don't think that this is something new. I think that there's been a concerted effort over many millennia to have people believe that the more civilized you are, there's certain things you don't engage in.
Yeah.
Death, get over it, get back to work. Because I mean, when you were talking, I was saying, look how systemic it is, right? I'm sure there's other cultures, probably like Sweden, right? Where, let a mother die, they come back to work in 5 months. And I don't know if that's true, but I think that other cultures that
right. Oh, yes.
This event has happened. You need time to recreate your
Yeah,
experience of life,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but we just don't do it
Well,
here.
I just want to also say I am so down with people picnicking at cemeteries. Let me just also,
Right.
my call to ministry and being at end of life, it really manifested out of working in a historic cemetery.
Wow.
And that may be another conversation to have, you and I, Trish. But so many conversations, John. But that historically, we had this connection to a place to come back to, like we can now call those historical cemeteries. But the vast majority of people dying today are either their choosing or their family's choosing cremation.
Right.
And that doesn't always include a place to return back to.
Right.
So this place of holding memory, holding remembrance, coming back to the landscape of a loved one who is buried there is also changing in our culture. 100 years ago, cremation, well, the Catholic Church was so totally against it that just trying to make sure my battery's still working here, sister. That we just it really is a new way of how to bury our loved ones or scatter our loved ones, and there's all sorts of different ways of doing that and how to do that, supported by choice, supported by love, is also changing as well, in ways that the cemeteries could have never predicted either, but that how people are doing their truth, their choice in lots of different ways, is also changing as well. But and I think that's one of those places, coming back to honoring your mom, Ja, and ancestors, then that's a big part of what anointing is all about. As we go back into ancestors of faith, so many traditions have used anointing oil, being the symbol of God, the human construct of the symbol of God on our, in our fingertips,
Right.
to anoint, has ancestral roots in the millennia too. And so when we think about how to call in ancestors of our faith, our ancestors of our lives, our ancestors of our traditions, I think that's one of those great honoring each other's truths as well, because I think we just don't always, we think that we do. We think that saying my condolences really is
it feels like a ritual, right? A sacred ritual. I said the words, I invoked it. Yeah.
I did what I needed to say, or said what I needed to say in a place where I don't even, when I hear that, I think, somebody's really struggling to find their language,
right.
because and how we can all be better at helping each other find our language and
right.
discover the language of loss and grief, and naming it. I mean, naming it in, like, when was the last time, I'll even own this for myself. I can't think of, well, I was just the other day about this sort of thing, but that's because I engage in this. But, people who have had somebody who's had a loss, I don't think we always are even able to check in with one another very well. I really, you're good at that, and I try to be good at that. But Larry Graham, who was an ILIF professor, I think you had his grief, death, loss class.
He was my mentor.
He was mine as well. I loved that guy. I only had one class with him, and it was the grief, death, dying, grief, and loss class. And I can remember sitting in a circle. Yeah. I was thinking about him when you were saying this, because he would sit in a circle with us and invoke all sorts of different ways of how we could find our own language around grief by providing resources to one another every time we met in community and class. And I was in class with him when the Virginia Tech shooting happened. And this is about modeling in the purest sense. And he would, the next day after the shooting, he said to all of us that I know of an ILF alum who actually is at Virginia Tech, and I contacted that person, and I just checked in to see if that person was okay, and to let them know that I was thinking of them. And I was still a student. I mean, I think this was like my first year in seminary. I was trying to figure out if I was really supposed to do what I felt that God had called me to do on those historic hills of landscape in the cemetery. And I was just really like, I was like, oh my God, he called somebody out of the blue just to see how they are. Well, that night, I don't know if you'd remember, but because it's a complicated story as well, but that the gentleman who was the shooter was a Korean American person. And I called one of my dearest friends who happened to have adopted Korean children. And then they were teenagers, really kind of grown up teenagers, probably 17, 18, something like old enough to know. And I called her and I said, I'm just checking in on you. And I'm checking in on the kids. How is it? Without Larry Graham telling me that story, I may not have ever figured that out on my own. I'm blessed. I'm so blessed because it's really become something like I check in. But it's all because I was taught that and modeled that.
Right.
And how we do that 6 months after somebody we know had a loved one die. How are you? Or I even put the the death date of friends' parents in my calendar. Right. So when the calendar comes up, I can just drop a note. I text a lot. Right. And say, I'm thinking of you today. And right. That's the stuff that can help us all move exactly. Through our grief by just knowing that we're loved and we're checked in on and we're listened to.
Yeah, for sure. And another wonderful transition, because I think, that's very deep in a good way, right? That good.
Right. Right.
It's a vibration that could have us go, whoa, right? So what I wanted to do was, because I think one of the things that I have experienced in this journey of chaplaincy is learned, not like they're the flip side of a coin, right? Because it's not that physical, but I find that there is a space within us all that if we do not allow ourselves the depth of one emotion, it is also very difficult to have the depth of another emotion, right? So right. We either see surface or we go deep, right? So right. I want to begin to have this conversation about, giving ourselves permission to grieve also gives us permission to find joy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that just takes a lot of time to really be able to find that place again, because I think sometimes we just don't always know how to call that back into our lives, right? I think ritual is one of those ways that can, right. And can hold that space of being able to, when does joy come? When joy comes,
right?
How do we know it?
Right.
Right.
Because it may change. It may change right. after that level of grieving. So joy right. changed for me after my mother died.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Did you know when joy reappeared?
It was interesting because I think because her death was unexpected, I thought I knew joy. I thought I did, right? Like I'm going through my life and life is whatever, right? Enjoy.
Right. Right.
Since
Right.
he died, I think the fragility and the randomness and
Right.
the
Right.
preciousness of life was right here. And
Mm.
so the thing that might not have given me joy then, because I had to have my high standard of what joy was, I just allowed myself to feel like joy was I dance with, I love this word dance, which is probably why I use the word dance, right? I dance with life differently. I dance with joy differently. I be present differently. I practice self-care differently. I honor every breath differently. Like the irony is I'm a former smoker, right? I quit smoking after my mother died
Wow.
because every breath became different.
Mm. Mm. Wow.
And then I think it's interesting because I made that choice, but then being a chaplain years later, when, a 22-year-old who was playing basketball yesterday is now code blue and doesn't make it, or, now being called to neonatal and mama had a checkup yesterday and then the baby somehow stopped breathing
Right.
today, right? So
Right.
you
Right.
start realizing every breath, every moment, right? So how dare me not find joy in this moment, right? How dare I not see the beauty in this moment, right? And it doesn't mean like I'm in this naive, like everything is joyous, everything is beautiful, but I do see that there are seeds of beauty and joy in everything. So, but I think it was only because I allowed myself to go so deeply in the grief, right? So
Yeah.
going deeply in the grief, what
Yes.
came out on the other side was a new relationship with joy and beauty and intimacy and connection, right? Like I can't even do surface, like, like, hey, how you doing? Like that whole thing where people are talking to you, but they're not really talking to you.
Right.
Like, I'd rather be like, oh, it's cool, let's not talk. But like, I
Right.
can't pretend that your life isn't the most amazing thing in front of me right now. And I can't pretend that me being able to engage with, right? And so it's different. It's deeper, it's richer. And I think you mentioned this thing about colors, right? The colors of joy have changed.
Absolutely. Well, and can I actually just extend that to, you said your life has changed, the way you want to live, your mortality, your understanding of life has,
Right.
and that's ultimately this gift of grief too, is how we can just ultimately,
Right.
maybe not in the raw places or the recent places, but as the patina grows into the years, be able to reflect back and say, whoa,
right,
wow, my life has changed for that.
right.
And whatever that language comes from that, whatever comes from that, kind of, that my life's changed, and I'm better for it, or whatever. It's been a gift, or it has turned into something that I never would have imagined in my life as being life-giving, or any of those, whatever everybody's truth language is around coming out of that, the rawest places, how to grow into that, and then it becomes a new part of you in many different ways. You've just described how that grief manifested in you, and it still is in you, and still is reflecting part of back of you, and it always will, and that's just the reality of how grief grows into us, in
And it's
mysterious ways.
It's almost like allowing yourself to not deny actually keeps the connection between myself and the beloved. Like it's still a vibration that still moves, right? I think if I denied the loss, and I denied the missing, if I denied the impact of that loss.
Mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm.
almost as if she or he or they, I'm done with them, right?
Right.
Right. So
Right.
it keeps them, and I think it's interesting because it makes me think of this resurrection differently, right? What does it mean to resurrect, right? We are so, and I think that's the whole Greek Roman thing, right? We are so fixated that the resurrection has to be physical, right? So
Right.
unless my mother's walking around in her new body, like I'm not thinking about her. No,
Right.
maybe resurrection is this idea that the essence of them, who they really are, who they are for me, who they are in the sacred and the divine, never ends.
And I think that is grief well done.
Yeah.
That was your question, right? How is grief
right?
well done? I think that is grief well done. That takes time.
Yeah.
That takes reflection work. That takes self-awareness work. All those things that we usually just don't ever carve out.
Right. We don't have time for it. Right. And I think once again, it's the intimacy and the vulnerability, those two deep, uncomfortable spaces, like we're also not prepared to go there, right? And the thing about it is, and this is a whole nother conversation, I have a hard time being with myself, and I can't have this conversation with someone else because they can't have that conversation with themselves, right? We end up being a culture of people that are very surface. We can only go but so deep. Vulnerability makes me anxious. Intimacy makes me uncomfortable. So then in this most sacred, poignant, heartfelt moment, I am ill-equipped to journey with myself or with anybody else. The healing, which is why I think chaplaincy matters, right? Because we're dealing with those issues, right?
Right. It's ultimately when we don't find people, or we think we're okay, but we've not processed this with anybody. It's in our headspace, and we haven't been able to be listened to. It's when those things happen that, and we haven't done our grief work around somebody who we love died, and then somebody else dies, and then there's a trigger for all of that we just don't know how to journey in, because we didn't heal our heart from this, and so somebody else dies, and there's this constant cyclical nature, really, of being able to not move well. And then we raise our kids in places where we just haven't always done, and there's no judging here. That is just the reality of living life day to day, and having to do the work, it's just living life that includes children and partners and work, and carving out time for yourself is not part of the paradigm of how we're taught to move through life gently with ourselves, lovingly, putting ourselves first. Oh my gosh,
But we still feel what we feel, which is why I think one of my theories, part of the foundation of why we are a country that's plagued with addiction, right? Because if I'm not allowed to journey process that, discuss that, talk about that, cry about that, then you know what? Just give me something where I won't feel any of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then we have a generation of parents and siblings and loved ones who are ill-equipped to actually being able to have a generation of people dying from overdoses, and we don't have a way to we don't have language around that. This is just this new phenomena about opioid addiction is just taking hundreds of thousands of people away from us, and families and loved ones are then having this new language around addiction deaths is huge for our culture. We just don't have that language right now.
Right.
And yet this phenomena is happening with best friends, loved ones, brothers, sisters,
Right.
sons,
And,
daughters,
and you know
parents.
me, right? I got to throw the cultural thing that I think it's new for white America, but I can remember.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. African
Yeah, thank
American,
you.
the crack epidemic was doing destruction, right? And so mothers with young children dying from crack or being zombies, and the kid is now with grandma. And,
Yeah.
so
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
so
you,
I
Ja.
mean, yeah, no worries.
No,
But I think
appreciate your
what
reflection.
oh, of course.
Yeah.
It's not, it's just a continued cycle, right? So I think we saw it, and this was a diverse thing, with the soldiers that came back from Vietnam, right? Addicted to
Right.
heroin. So I think the difference this time, is we didn't expect it to be middle class white America in, the whatever they call that, the belt, like we didn't expect it to be in
Yeah.
Kansas, right? 17-year-olds cheerleader, right? So but I think, in the 60s they talked about the different cultures, how we are impacted, right, by the culture. So I think what happened is it's sort of like this onion, right? Is that it's just going deeper and deeper and deeper. And so first it was the marginalized people, right? Then it was the women, right? Mothers, little helpers, right? But now it's almost as if it is like this, I see visually, like, how Hiroshima, like it just came up and exploded over everything. So I think that is a reflection of the brokenness of our culture, that no one now can escape the pain, not even, upper middle class. You got everything that should make you happy. It's hurting, right?
Right.
So that to me is a reflection of how much our culture needs to heal, because no one's escaping. There is no privilege to get you, like, do not pass go, right? Like everybody's plagued. So so in our remaining few minutes, what I'd love to do is dance around some of the rituals that are possible, that, whether someone is, what, I'm in the middle of my addiction right now and I don't believe in anything called God, or, I had a partner that died 15 years ago and I'm still hurting, or, I lost whomever, right? What are some of the things that folks can do day to day as they're either raising kids, dealing with marriages, going to work, but you know what, I still got to heal this. So what can I do?
Right. Well, I'm going to kind of just give my list that doesn't take much time and doesn't cost much money.
Cool.
Right. So I think the first one is breathing. Right. Okay.
Unless you have, what is that, COPD, then it could be very
okay. That could be problematic. Right. Hopefully you're on oxygen. Hopefully you're on oxygen. But like sometimes we just don't, take time to just breathe. And that could be sitting in the car, waiting for your children to come into the car that you're going to take them to school, or just taking some breaths. Just breath work. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about breath work all the time, around breathing in and breathing out. If we just did that, we just took some time to just go, that's great self-care. I love candles, and I think that, the metaphor is lighting light in the world. So light a candle at dinner time. Create some rituals for your families, but connect some rituals to you. But like creating light for one another, lighting a candle, having a place to actually just sit and be. We had some. There was a few years back where I was. I would spray a spritzer distilled water and essential oils as a grounding place for me to kind of leave one place to another. I used it in my hospice practice work for just like a grounding, like I'm just going to spray this all over myself, just kind of, and then I'm going to open the door, and then I'm going to go outside into the world, from my car, just finding a place to do that, create that. I love creating burning incense, and that means everything from dried herbs in a pot with a piece of charcoal, and anybody can ask questions about how to find these things. I'm happy to be that kind of resource for you and the Cyber Lounge. But that I think ritual making is all about sometimes going back to something, but also can be starting something new. So ritual making can be like how you're going to do food differently, how you're going to create places for community differently, how you want to be different in setting a new course with like, this is how I'm going to start my day. I'm going to sleep well. I'm going to create some sleep well places for me. There's lots of places. I'm going to sleep well, get up, and I'm going to do this. And then, I know how so many friends whose coffee is their ritual in the morning. Honor it, claim it, speak it, share it. Say, this is what I'm doing for myself. Because we can do this in our head, but really it's about a practice. And it's about like how doing is, we just can't be thinking about it. Doing is, it's why I wanted to light a light for us, to kind of like symbolize to me, we are light. And we're honoring this symbol of, to me, that the sacred is here with us, you and me. Some people, do, I would even say grace before meals is a form of ritual. If you've never done that, create something for you. Light a candle, especially if you're eating by yourself. Create some places of self-care for you. But if you have a family, and let's create some wider light for one another in creating rituals, especially and again, I go back to children, because I think children are trying to find their way in a place of conversation that sometimes doesn't include them, but bringing them into like, hey, anniversary, birthdays, your birthdays, trying to create, the sacred in our kids' lives are really, ritual making is getting, I don't think it's a dying art at all by any means, but it is a reminder that all of us need to be practicing. How do we take care of each other well? How do we feed each other? How do we provide the herbal tea that we need? I'm here in this wonderful bookstore in the Pacific Northwest, and there's a teapot every day here. Make tea for one another. Drink tea with each other. Find places to connect with people that are there for you. Who might have even just said, hey, I'm here for you. Call them and say, hey, you said you were here for me. I really need you to be here for me. Can you come over and let's make some tea together.
And so,
it's why we do food together, Ja.
And that's what I was going to say, that there's not much that I could add. For me, what rituals do is slow me down, get me present, get me relational, right?
Amen.
Relational with the ancestor, or relational with a good girlfriend, or relational with, I'm going to hit this bell and I'm just going to listen and be present to what it does to my being, or put on an incense and allow my amygdala to get all happy, right?
Well, and music, can definitely be a ritual making for ourselves and for each other.
Right. And it gets us in the body and out of the body at the same time, right? That's the paradox.
Right.
So,
Yes, not stuck. Moving.
No. Yes.
There's movement. There's a dance.
We're dancing, right? So here's the thing.
Hey. Thank you for this time together.
So let's do this again, because
let's do this again.
So question, I also noticed that we probably missed a few minutes at the beginning. The recording wasn't happening, but that's okay. But just because I don't know where we began and what got left off, let people know your name, where they can find you in the social media spaces.
Right.
Whatever info you want to give out, like website or whatever. Go ahead. So go.
Okay, good. So I'm Nancy Nero, and my email address is nancy@anointjourney.com. You can find me on Facebook, and please friend me. I would love to be your friend on Facebook. And you can also like Anoint, and you can find Anoint at Anoint, and you can find Anoint through me, Nancy Nero, on Facebook. I'm dabbling in Instagram, and I'm just maybe need a little shove into it, but you can find me on Facebook, and I'm pretty active doing that. I travel a bit, and Denver is my home, so I would love to visit with you anytime.
Well, believe it or not, most of the people in the Cyber Lounge are not from Denver. That's the shocking part.
Oh, well, I could visit with you over Skype or Zoom.
There you go.
And the website for Anoint is www.anointjourney.com, and you can find a whole new world of love and support there. And call me. My info is all over the website. So
I'm going to put you on the spot before I let you go and ask you, would you consider being part of the white privilege conversation that I'm going to be having in the new year? So you don't have to say yes or no now.
Oh, no, absolutely.
I know the people would love to see you again.
Yes. Please. Yes. Thank you. This has been just delicious. Thank you so much.
I know, right? It's amazing. So thank you everybody for tuning in. The only thing that I will add that I think may not have been on the recording is, and Nancy and I talk about this all the time, is that, this conversation about death and dying and the journey out of the body is very challenging for many of us because our culture somehow transitions, and instead of being, the bodies being at home, grandpa being on the bed and the kids jumping over the body and saying, that's my grandpa, he died, we started moving that out of the home and into these funeral parlors, and that transition to, folks wanting to be with the death process in a really different way, even to the point where now we do closed caskets, or, we're going to do the memorial, but we'll never have the funeral. And so one of the reasons that Nancy and I decided to do this is because we do believe that human beings are amazing and phenomenal and filled with the potential to love each other in awesome ways. But we know that there's some pain, there's some wounds.
Totally.
And one of them is like this big impending doom, fear of we're going to die. But as we said yesterday when we were preparing, is that if we do not know how to die, it's very difficult for us to know how to live.
Absolutely.
So these are some life skills, right? We're talking about death, but they're really life skills.
So, but, also coupled with that is that some of this conversation could have been triggered for some real grief and sadness in the language of conversation. Right. So I just want to honor that in so many people who might be listening and watching to us today, that this has not been your experience, and your experience was something very different, and that our conversation might trigger any kind of sadness and grief. I just want to be honest about that as well, because we're here for you too. And
right. So that's actually very important, right?
Right.
So that if under this video, you feel now the heartbreak that has reminded you of your beloved, and you don't have anybody to talk to, I think as chaplains, community chaplains, I know that we have dedicated our lives to being there for community. So you can inbox either one of us.
Absolutely.
Or you know what? Feel free to just start a conversation like, hey, lounge, I need some help. I am crying right here. And that's one of the things that I love about our small community is that we do sort of jump in and hold each other lovingly, accountably. So do whatever it is that feels like self-care to you, right? So if that's inboxing someone, and I always tell people, and I'm sure this is for Nancy too, like, we're strong. So if you just want to yell, shout, like, we're here to be that soft place for you to fall.
Absolutely.
Right? So that's fine.
Absolutely.
So thank you. We don't want to have to listen to a 5-hour webinar, but it's been a joy. I love you, my sister.
I love you, my sister. I will see you soon.
We'll send this around. And what I'll probably do is let it be password protected. So I'll give you the password, and then you can tell the people, because this is intimate, right? So we don't want just the crazy human being losing their mind saying,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Yes. Well, I'll figure it out. If we can, we can. If we can't, we can't.
Okay.
Peace and blessings to you. Thank you.
And to you. Thank you.
Right. Let me figure out how to end this.